Welcome back. In today's episode, I'm going to narrate true Irish horror stories. So make sure to hit like and subscribe and share this with your friends. Also, let me know where you're watching from. Thanks. I should have known something was wrong when my daughter Siobhan came back from the fairy ring. But grief does strange things to a man's judgment, and I'd been half mad with loss for 3 days. She'd been missing since Tuesday morning when she'd gone to gather blackberries in the hills outside Donegal. Siobhan was only 8, but she knew those paths better than most adults. Her grandmother had walked with her since she was a toddler, teaching her which mushrooms were safe to eat, which stones marked the old boundaries, and which places were best left alone. Of course, the fairy ring was one of those places. I told her 100 times to stay away from that circle of standing stones. The Hall of the Fairies, they called it, and with good reason. Local children had been vanishing there for generations, although most came back within a day or two, with no memory of where they had been. That was the lucky ones. But Siobhan had always been drawn to the forbidden places, just like her mother before her. Mary used to say, I'd rather had one foot in this world and one in the other, and she'd cross herself when she said it, as if the words themselves were rather dangerous. We searched every bog and hollow, every cave and crevice in those hills. The guards came up for Letterkenny with their dogs and more modern equipment, treating me with that careful politeness they reserve for the bereaved. They found their basket of blackberries overturned near the old stone bridge, but found nothing more. By the third day, they were speaking in the past tense and talking about searching in the river. I kept walking those ancient paths long after all the others had given up, calling her name until my voice was nothing but a croak. The locals watched me from their windows with pity in their eyes, and Mrs. Flanagan from the village shop brought me sandwiches, which I couldn't eat, and tea that tasted like ash. On the third night, when the moon was full and the mist rolled down the mountains like the breath of sleeping giants, I found her. She was sitting in the exact centre of that damned fairy ring, cross-legged on the grass, as if she'd been waiting there for me all along. The ancient stones loomed around her in the moonlight, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. She was humming a tune I'd never heard before, something that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Siobhan, I whispered, afraid to step into the circle, afraid to break whatever spell kept her there. She turned to me with eyes too bright, pupils dilated so wide they looked completely black. Da, she said, but her voice carried an echo, like she was speaking from the bottom of a deep well or across a vast distance. I wanted to snatch her up and run, but something was keeping me rooted to the spot. The way she tilted her head when she looked at me, like a bird studying an insect. The way her smile was just a fraction too wide. The way the shadows seemed to bend toward her instead of away. Where have you been, love? I asked, taking a careful step closer. We've all been worried sick. I went to visit the fair folk, she said in that echoing voice. They showed me such wonderful things. Would you like to see? But before I could answer, the air inside the circle shimmered like heat waves, and for a moment I glimpsed something else. A vast hall, carved from living rock, lit by fires that cast no smoke. Beautiful creatures danced to the music that made my bones ache with longing, and I understood why so many children never came back. Then the vision faded, and there was only my daughter sitting in the grass, humming that ancient tune. I carried her home that night, and she felt solid and real in my arms. She smelled like earth and wildflowers and something else, something sweet and wild that reminded me of honey left too long in the sunlight. The whole way down the mountain, she whispered stories in my ear about the underground kingdom, about the lords and ladies who ruled there, and about the gifts that they'd given her. I should have noticed the signs immediately, how she never ate the bread. After that, only honey and cream and berries that grew in wild and shadowed places. How she spoke sometimes in a language that predated Gaelic, words that made my teeth ache and set the dogs to howling. How the farm animals wouldn't come near her anymore, and how the iron cross above her bed had tarnished black overnight. How she never seemed to sleep, but lay in her bed with those two bright eyes wide open, listening to sounds that only she could hear. The neighbours began to whisper. Mrs. O'Brien, from the next farm over, crossed herself whenever she saw Siobhan, muttering prayers under her breath. Father McKenna came to visit more often. His holy water and blessed metals seemed to make Siobhan uncomfortable in a way they'd never had before. That's not your daughter anymore, Seamus, old Paddy Malone told me one evening down at O'Sullivan's pub. I've seen it before. The fair folk, they take our children and leave something else in their place. Something that looks right, but isn't. Not really. I wanted to hit him for saying that, but deep down, I knew he was right. This thing wearing my daughter's face would stand at the windows for hours, staring up at the hills with an expression of terrible longing. Sometimes I caught her having conversations with the empty air, giggling at jokes only she could hear. But she was still my daughter. She had to be. She had Siobhan's memories, her laugh, her way of scrunching up her nose when she was thinking. When she called me Dad and asked for bedtime stories, my heart broke with love for her. The truth came to me slowly, like dawn creeping over the mountains. I began to notice things going missing from the village. Small things at first. A toy left in a garden, a child's coat hung on a washing line. Then larger things. Mrs. Gallagher's grandson disappeared 2 days before wandering back with the same dreamy expression that Siobhan wore. The Murphy's youngest daughter came home speaking in tongues and refusing to enter the village church. They were collecting them, building an army of changelings, each one a doorway between our world and theirs. The final revelation came on a night when thunder rolled across the mountains, like the footsteps of giants. I woke to find my Siobhan, or the thing that wore a shape, standing at the foot of my bed. In the lightning flashes, her child's face was stretched into something ancient and knowing, beautiful and terrible, as all the creatures from her story. The others want to go home too, Dad, she said, and her voice the sound of wind through the standing stones and of water flowing over ancient bones. Will you help them? Through the rain-streaked window, I could see them, dozens of children with faces I almost recognised, standing in our garden with the same terrible brightness in their eyes. Children who'd gone missing from villages all across the county over the years, all waiting for their invitation to cross over completely. I understood then. Each changeling was a bridge, a way for the fair folk to extend their reach into our world. And now they wanted to open the door wide enough for an invasion. I grabbed the iron poker from my fireplace, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Iron was supposed to hurt them, drive them away. But when I turned back to threaten the thing wearing my daughter's face, I found the real Siobhan there instead. She was crying, small and human, and heartbreakingly fragile. The terrible brightness was gone from her eyes, replaced by fear and confusion. "Dad, please," she sobbed, reaching for me with hands that shook like leaves. "They won't let me go unless someone takes my place. They said you'd understand. They said blood calls to blood, and family protects family." That's when I realised the horrible truth. My daughter, my real daughter, had found her way back to me. But the price of her freedom was letting the thing that had worn her face stay in our world. And worse, it wanted to bring its family through with it. The children in the garden pressed closer to the windows, their faces shifting between human and something else, and the lightning flashes. I could feel their hunger, like a physical weight, their desperate need to belong somewhere, to have families who would love them, despite what they are. "Choose, Dad," Siobhan whispered. "Choose quickly, before they change their minds." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw the truth written in her eyes. She'd been fighting to come back to me for 3 days, battling her way through whatever otherworldly realm had claimed her. She was thin and pale, marked by her struggle, but she was mine. The iron poker grew warm in my hands. Outside, the changing children began to keen, a sound like wind through a graveyard that put my soul on edge. I made my choice. When the guards found me the next morning, I was sitting in the fire ring with my daughter in my arms, both of us human, both of us home. The standing stones had cracked down their centres, and the grass within the circle had turned as black as burnt peat. I never found the other children, the ones who'd been waiting in my garden. Some say they went back to the firefolk, defeated and furious. Others whisper that they're still out there somewhere, looking for new families to claim, new bridges to build between the worlds. But Siobhan came home to stay, and that's all that matters to a father's heart. Even if sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the mist rolls down from the mountains, I catch her humming that ancient tune and wonder what price I'll eventually have to pay for the choice I made. The first time I heard her, I thought it was the wind in the eaves of our cottage in Connemara, mourning for the summer that was dying with the last days of September. My grandmother had been feeling for weeks, her breath going shallower each day, and I'd come home from Dublin to sit watch. Nana Bridget had raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 12, and I couldn't bear the thought of her dying alone in this isolated cottage where she lived for 87 years. The cottage sat on the edge of the bog, where the peat dark water reflected the sky like a black mirror. It had belonged to our family for generations, built on land that was older than my memory, where the boundaries between worlds grew thin in the mist. The sound started just after midnight on my second night home, a low, mournful wail that seemed to seep through the very stones of the house. It rose and fell like the tide, carrying notes of grief so pure and deep they made my bones ache in sympathy. "Do you hear that, Nana?" I asked, but she slipped into that place between sleeping and dying, where the words couldn't reach her. Her breathing was so faint, I had to lean close to be sure she was still with us. I'd been away from Ireland too long, working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, believing I'd left the old superstitions behind with my childhood. But sitting in that ancient cottage with my grandmother dying and the bog whispering its secrets outside the windows, I felt like the modern world falling away from me, like an old discarded coat. The keening grew stronger the second night. I couldn't ignore it anymore, or pretend it was just the wind. The sound was too purposeful, too full of conscious grief. It spoke of losses beyond counting, of hearts broken by death and time, and the cruel mathematics of love. I wrapped my coat around my shoulders and stepped out into the Irish night. The bog stretched away into darkness, punctured by pools of standing water that reflected the stars back like scattered diamonds. The keening seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, as if the land itself was mourning. I followed the sound across the moor, my feet finding the old pathways by instinct. The peat squashed beneath my boots, and the will-o'-wisps danced in my peripheral vision, though I told myself they were just marsh gas, natural phenomena that had nothing to do with the restless dead. The crying led me to an old stone circle at the heart of the bog, where our ancestors had made their offerings to the gods, whose names were forgotten before Christ came to Ireland. The standing stones were worn smooth by wind and rain, carved with spirals and symbols that predated writing. And there in the centre of the circle stood a woman dressed in grey. Her hair streamed like a mist in a wind I couldn't feel, and her face was turned up to the stars, as if she were singing to them. She was beautiful in the way that wild places are beautiful, terrible and perfect, and utterly inhuman. Her mouth was wide open, and from it poured the most heartbroken sound I'd ever heard. I should have run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn and flee back to the safety of the electric lights and modern skepticism. But I couldn't move. The keening held me transfixed, speaking to something deep in my blood that remembered when the world was younger and stranger. The woman in grey slowly turned her head toward me, and I saw her face clearly in the starlight. It was my own face, aged and hollowed by grief I had not yet experienced. My blood turned to ice, not because I saw her, though that was terrifying enough, because I recognised the expression she wore. It was a look I'd seen in myself in mirrors after my parents had died. The hollowed eye stare of someone who'd lost everything that mattered She pointed one pale finger at me, then at the cottage where my grandmother lay dying, and her mouth opened wider than any human mouth should. The sound that emerged wasn't just mourning, it was a prophecy, and I understood with terrible clarity that she wasn't keening for my grandmother. She was practicing for me. The vision struck me like a physical blow. Myself at 35, standing over my grandmother's grave, as the last of my family was lowered into the earth. Then later, much later, standing over other graves, friends, lovers, colleagues, as I grew old and everyone I cared about fell away from me one by one. I saw myself in 40 years, alone, in the same dying cottage, dying as my grandmother was dying, with no one to hold my hand or sing me to sleep. I saw the woman in grey coming for me then, wearing a face that would be weathered and broken by decades of accumulated loss. The banshee, for that's what she was. I knew it now, didn't just foretell death. She showed you the shape of your own ending, the particular flavour of grief that would define you in your final years. I stumbled backward, breaking eye contact, and the vision shattered. The keening woman smiled with my face, inclining her head as if she were pleased I understood. Then she faded like mist, leaving only the wind and the whisper of water over stone. I ran back to the cottage, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nana was still breathing when I reached her bedside. I took her hand in mine, feeling how cold and fragile she'd become. "There's something you need to know," she whispered, without opening her eyes. "About our family, about the woman in the grey." I leaned closer, straining to hear her feeling voice. "We're the Keenan woman, love," she said. "Have been for generations. It's not a curse, it's a calling. Someone has to sing the dead to the rest. Someone has to remember their names and mourn them properly." I wanted to deny it, tell her she was delirious, that the dying sometimes said strange things. But I remembered my great-grandmother's funeral when I was small, how the old woman had keen firm voices that raised the hair in my arms. I remembered the stories about my great-great-grandmother who could predict deaths before they happened and always appeared at funerals uninvited. "I don't want it," I whispered. "Neither did I," Nana smiled. "Neither did she who came before me. But someone has to sing the songs. Someone has to remember." She died peacefully the next morning as the sun rose over the bog, and I thought the woman in grey would disappear with her. The funeral was small, just myself and a few of the elderly neighbours who'd remembered when Bridget Murphy was young and strong. I tried to cry for her, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself humming a tune I'd never heard before, something that seemed to rise from within me. After the funeral, I stayed in the cottage. I told myself it was just for a few days, to sort through her things and arrange for the sale of the property. But days turned to weeks, and I found myself reluctant to leave. The woman in grey remained in the garden, visible only at dawn and dusk. She was waiting, I realised, for me to accept what I was becoming. Each day, I could see the resemblance growing stronger, my cheeks growing gaunt from grief, my hair taking on that ethereal quality. It seemed to move in winds that others couldn't feel. I tried to return to Dublin, to my modern life and rational expectations. But the city felt wrong now, too bright and loud, and disconnected from the deep currents of life and death that flowed beneath the surface of things. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't pretend that code and algorithms mattered, when I could hear the keening in every sound, and car horns and sirens, and children crying, and lovers quarrelling. The first time I keened for someone else was Mrs. O'Malley down the road. I woke up one October morning knowing she had died in her sleep, though no one had called to tell me. I walked to her cottage in my nightgown, bare feet silent on the frost-hard ground, and stood beneath her bedroom window. The sound that came from my throat was not my own voice. It was older, deeper, carrying the grief of generations of Irish women who had loved and lost and loved again. Mrs. O'Malley's son found me there when he came to check on his mother, and instead of being frightened, he thanked me. She always said someone would sing for her when it was time, he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. She said the old ways weren't truly dead, while there were still women who remembered the songs. I've been here 6 months now, and I understand everything my grandmother tried to tell me. The banshee doesn't just foretell death, she creates her own successor. The keening has become my voice, woven into my heartbeat and breathing. I can see through the walls now to where death waits. In Dublin and Cork and in little villages across Ireland. I know when the fisherman's wife in Galway will lose her husband to the sea. I know when the young mother in Belfast will get a call about her soldier son. I know when the old priest in Killarney will say his last mass and meet his God face to face. And I sing for them all. Soon I'll walk to someone else's window and keen for their beloved dead. Soon another woman will see my face and recognise her future in it. Perhaps my sister's daughter, who just turned 21 and comes to visit sometimes, looking at me with eyes that hold too much understanding. The sound never stops now. It's become a part of me, woven into my heartbeat, my breathing. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer each night, I can hear the next voice, learning the song. The bog remembers everything, every death, every love, every choice that echoes down through the generations. Am I in its memory, made flesh, its voice given human form? When I die, another will take my place, and the chain remain unbroken. It's not the fate I would have chosen for myself, but it's the one my blood chose for me. And there's a strange peace in that acceptance. I am the bridge between the living and the dead, the voice that remains, the world that every ending deserves a song, even if that song is a sorrow-given sound. I've been cutting peat from this bog for 30 years, and I thought I knew every secret it held in its dark embrace. The bog belonged to my grandfather before me, and his grandfathers before him, stretching back through generations of my family who worked on this black earth outside of Galway. We'd inherited not just the land, but the knowledge of how to read it, where the peat was the sweetest, where it burned the longest, and where the old things lay buried in layers of compressed time. Over the years, we'd pulled strange treasures from the depths, coins from centuries past, their faces worn smooth by the bog's patient chemistry, bits of pottery painted with symbols no scholar could decipher, once even a sword that the museum men said was older than the Vikings, its blade still sharp after 1,000 years of darkness. The bog preserved everything. Wood became ebony, flesh became leather, secrets became legend. It was nature's archive, holding the history of our land in its acidic embrace. But in all those years of cutting and hauling peat, through all the family stories passed down like heirlooms, we'd never pulled up Declan O'Sullivan. I knew it was him the moment I saw his face emerging from the peat, perfectly preserved, as if he'd been sleeping there, rather than being dead. The bog had been kind to him, his features intact, his dark hair still thick, his skin tanned the colour of old leather, but recognisably human. Declan, who disappeared 20 years ago, on the night he was meant to marry my sister. Declan, who'd broken her heart and left her at the altar, running off to America to make his fortune. We all thought, or that's how the story went in the village anyway. Whispered for sympathy, for poor Mairead, who'd been left standing in her wedding dress, with half the county. But here he was, throat cut, as neat as you please, still wearing his wedding suit. The morning coat was stained dark, with bog water and something else, but I could still make out the buttonhole where his carnation had been. His hands were folded across his chest, as if someone had composed them for burial, and around his ring finger was the gold band that should have been on my sister's hand. I stood there in the cutting for a long moment, my spade forgotten in my hands, staring at the corpse that had just rewritten 20 years of family history. Above me, the grey Irish sky pressed down like a weight, and the bog stretched away in all directions. Thousands of acres of dark water and older secrets. The wind carried the scent of rain and peat smoke from the village, where my sister still lived, in the cottage we'd grown up in. Mairead had never married after Declan left. She turned inward, becoming the village herowoman, the one people came to for remedies and advice. She grew strange plants in her garden and spoke sometimes to things others couldn't see. I should have called the guards immediately upon discovery. I should have done the proper thing, notified the authorities, and let them handle the investigation. But something kept me crouched there, beside the grave the bog had given up, studying Declan's peaceful face and wondering what stories he might tell. The terrible part wasn't finding him. It was my sister's eyes when I told her what I found. I walked to her cottage as the sun was still setting, turning the bog waters red as blood. Mairead was in her garden, tending the plants that bloomed in defiance of the season. Night blooming cereus and ghost orchids, things that don't grow in Irish soil, but thrived under her care. She looked up when I approached, and I saw that she already knew. Her face held calm, as someone who'd been waiting 20 years to have this conversation. I wonder when you'd finally dig deep enough, she said. She wiped her hands on her apron and gestured towards the cottage. Come on, I'll put the kettle on. The cottage was the same as it had been when we were children, low-beamed and cosy, filled with the scents of dried herbs and old wood smoke. But there were new additions that I hadn't noticed before. mirrors covered in black cloth, salt lines at every threshold, protection charms hanging from the rafters. Maria poured tea with steady hands, adding honey from her own beehives. When she sat across from me at the old oak table, she looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by years of carrying a secret. "Tell me," I said simply. She smiled, and for a moment I saw the girl she'd been before Declan broke her heart. "You always were direct, Brendan, straight to the point. No dancing around the truth." She told me about that night, how she followed him into the bog, where he was meant to meet his other woman. A woman from Belfast none of us knew about. The wealthy merchant's daughter, who'd been sending him letters for months. Mairead had found the correspondence hidden in his things, read every living word of love and false promises. I confronted him about it, she said, her voice steady as stone. Asked him if he meant to go through with the wedding, knowing he had another woman waiting. If he planned to make a fool of me in front of God and everyone. Declan had laughed at her, told her the truth with a cruel honesty, that he never loved her, that he only proposed because her father had promised him a share in the family bog, that he'd been stringing along the Belfast woman too, playing all sides for whatever advantage he could gain. He said I should be grateful for the attention, Mairead continued, her knuckles white as she gripped her teacup. Said a plain girl like me shouldn't expect fidelity from a man like him. That if I kept quiet about the other arrangements, he might even visit my bed occasionally after the wedding. I felt my own hands clenched into fist. Even dead for 20 years, Declan could still make my blood boil with his casual cruelty. "So I killed him," Mairead said simply, picked up a piece of broken stone and opened his throat while he was still laughing at me. The knife came later. I wanted it to look deliberate, not like an accident. She described it with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used for her recipes, how his blood had looked black in the moonlight, how he'd stopped laughing very quickly, how surprised he'd seemed, the plain little Mairead had in her to fight back. "I dragged him to the deepest part of the bog," she said, "a place where Grandad used to say the water had no bottom. I weighed him down with stones and pushed him under, and the bog took him like it was hungry for him. I wanted to be shocked, wanted to feel horror at my sister's confession, but all I felt was a grim satisfaction that Declan had finally paid for his cruelty. The bog had held its secret for 20 years, but now that secret was free. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mairead stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where our family photos were arranged like a shrine. She took down a frame I never paid much attention to. An old picture of her great-grandmother standing beside the bog. "The bog keeps secrets, Brendan," she said, handing me the photograph. "Always has. That's why the family's been working on it all these generations. We're not just cutting the peat, we're the caretakers." I looked more closely at the photograph and felt my blood chill. In the background, barely visible, in the sepia tones, I could make out shapes in the bog water. Faces, pale and still, watching from their dark beds. Mairead led me deeper into the cottage then, to the cellar I'd never seen. The walls lined with photographs going back decades. Pictures of our family standing proudly beside the bog, generation after generation of cutters and caretakers. And in each photograph, if you look carefully, you could see them. The faces on the peat, the preserved dead who had found their way into the bog's embrace. Some looked peaceful, some looked surprised, but all of them looked grateful to finally rest. The bog remembers everything, Mairead said. Every secret, every sin, every necessary death. And we remember for the bog. She showed me the record books, ledgers kept by our family for over 2 centuries, documenting the peat harvests, but also the other things they found: names, dates, causes of death, a careful accounting of the bog's collections. Most had been accidents, people who'd fallen in during the dark, or had been caught by the treacherous footing. But some entries were marked different, with the symbols I was beginning to understand. These were the ones like Declan, people who needed to disappear, whose death served the greater balance. We're not killers, Brendan. We're gardeners. Sometimes the garden needs pruning to stay healthy. She told me about the others over the years. The landlord who'd been evicting families during the famine, the informer who'd been selling names to the British, the priest who'd been taking liberties with the village children. All of them had found their way into the bog, and all of them had been forgotten by everyone except their family. The bog chooses, she said. It calls to the ones who've upset the balance, who've caused more harm than good, and we answer that call. I should have run then. Should have called the guards and turned my own sister in. But when I looked at the photographs, I saw my own face among the caretakers, and I understood that some traditions run deeper than law. The bog had been kind to our family for generations. It had given us warmth in winter, work in times of hardship, purpose when the world seemed cruel and random, and in return, we gave it what it needed. What about this woman from Belfast? I asked. What happened there? Mairead smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. She waited for him at the coach inn for 3 days. Then she went home and married a banker, had 5 children, and lived to be 91. Declan would have ruined her life if I'd let him. I helped her rebury Declan deeper that night, in a part of the bog where the water ran black as ink and reflected no stars. The peat closed over him like a hungry mouth, and I felt the bog's satisfaction, like a purr in the earth beneath my feet. My sister smiled and went back to her knitting, and I went back to cutting peat, but everything was different now. I could hear the bog speaking when I work, feel its ancient intelligence stirring beneath my feet. I understood why our family had stayed here so long, why we'd never left for cities or emigrated to America like so many others. We belonged to the bog as much as it belonged to us. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, when the mist rose like spirits from the dark water, I could hear them whispering all the secrets the bog had swallowed, all the sins it had digested, all the stories it kept buried in its depths. Most of them were peaceful voices, grateful for the rest, but some carried warnings, speaking of new imbalances that needed correcting, new thorns that needed pruning from the garden. I've learned to listen to those voices, and I've learned that the bog is patient, but not passive, kind, but not weak. It remembers everything, every kindness, every cruelty, every choice that echoes down through the generations. And when the time comes for me to add my own secrets, I know it will welcome me home, as gently as it welcomed Declan, as gently as it welcomed all the others, whose names are in the ledger. Until then, I am its servant and guardian, keeper of its secrets, and executor of its will. The bog has chosen me, as it chose my sister, and as it chose our fathers before us. And I wonder sometimes what secrets my own children will inherit when they're old enough to understand the true nature of the family business. I never believed in speaking to the dead until my wife Clara made me a believer from beyond the grave. We'd lived in an old Georgian house in Cork for 15 years. Clara and I raising our 3 children in rooms that sheltered families for 2 centuries before us. The house came with stories, as all old Irish houses do. Tales of previous owners, unexplained sounds, the usual folklore that collects around old walls like dust. Clara loved these stories, said she'd researched the house's history at the library, tracing back through the deeds and death certificates to piece together the lives of families who'd lived there before us. She had a gift for making the past feel immediate, turning dusty records into vivid narratives of love and loss. It started as entertainment at dinner parties. Clara would regale our guests with tales of the house's previous inhabitants, the merchant family who'd built it in 1847, the Anglo-Irish widow who'd lived here alone for 40 years, the couple who died in the flu pandemic of 1918. She had a talent for bringing history to life. She then began claiming she could sense them. It started small, a feeling of being watched in certain rooms, cold spots that had no explanation, the sound of footsteps in the empty hallways. I dismissed it as imagination, a natural result of spending too much time researching death records and tragic histories. But Clara insisted the dead were trying to communicate. They have unfinished business, she'd say, standing in the drawing room where the merchant's daughter had died of consumption in 1851. Stories they need to tell, messages they need to pass on. This house is full of them, Patrick. All we need to do is listen. She said we should start holding seances. At first, they were just fun. Dinner parties with a supernatural theme, candles and Ouija boards, and theatrical dramatics. They made our friends laugh nervously. Clara would go into trances, speaking in voices that weren't her own, delivering messages from the spirits who inhabited our house. I thought it was all performance, clever theatrics, based on her research. Clara had always been creative and always drawn to drama. The seances seemed like a natural extension of her storytelling gifts. But then she started getting things right, details that she couldn't possibly know. Mrs. Hennessy, from down the street, attended one of these seances. Skeptical but curious, Clara went under her trance and began speaking in the voice of an old man, claiming to be Mrs. Hennessy's father. "Tell her about the letters," the voice said, coming through Clara's mouth. "The ones I had in the biscuit tin, behind the flower. She'll want to read them before it's too late." Mrs. Hennessy went white as chalk. After the seance, she confessed that her father had been a notoriously private man who'd never spoken about his time in the war. She'd searched his house after he died, but never found anything. She went home that night and tore apart the kitchen until she found the biscuit tin. Inside were dozens of letters from French villages thanking her father for his kindness to refugees during the war, a side of him she never known existed. Word quickly spread through the village of Clara's gift. People began coming to our house, seeking contact with their lost loved ones, and Clara never turned anyone away. She had a rare compassion for grief, understanding that sometimes the living need permission from the dead to move on. I watched my wife change during these months. The seances drained her, left her pale and exhausted, as if something was feeding on her energy. She complained of weird dreams, of voices calling her name from empty rooms, of feeling pulled towards something she couldn't identify. "They're getting stronger," she told me one evening. "The dead, they're learning to use me as a conduit. I don't think I can control it much longer." I begged her to stop, but Clara insisted she had a responsibility to help people find peace. She'd made contact with spirits who'd been trapped in the house for decades, she said, and they were depending on her to relay their messages. The end came in November, when the fog rolled in from the sea like a breath of dying giants. Clara had scheduled a private seance for Mr. O'Brien, whose son had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier. The young man had been driving drunk, and his father was consumed with guilt over their last argument. Harsh words that he could never take back. I was working late that night, grading papers in my study, while Clara held the seance in the room below. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The air itself seemed thick, resistant, as if reality was straining under some unseen pressure. Around midnight, I heard Clara scream. I ran downstairs to find her collapsed on the floor, convulsing as if she were having a seizure. Mr. O'Brien was backed against the wall, his face white with terror, crossing himself repeatedly. "She's speaking in tongues." She started with my boy's voice, but then others joined in, dozens of them, all talking at once. Clara's body arched impossibly, her mouth opening wider than any human mouth should. A chorus of voices poured out, men, women, children, all speaking over each other in languages I couldn't identify. Some sounded ancient, predating any known tongue, while others carried accents from every corner of the country. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and her skin was cold as marble, despite the violent tremors coming from her body. I tried to hold her still, but she was stronger than she'd ever been in life, as if something else was controlling her movements. Then suddenly, silence. Clara went limp in my arms, her breathing so shallow I had to lean close to be sure she was still alive. When her eyes opened, they were her own again. Frightened, confused, and somehow diminished. "Patrick, they're angry, all of them. I've been keeping them from what they want." "What do they want?" I asked. She looked at me with eyes full of terrible knowledge. "To live again, really live. They've been feeding off the energy from the seances, growing stronger, learning how to possess the living. They don't want to deliver messages anymore. They want bodies to inhabit." The doctor came in the morning and found nothing physically wrong with Clara. but she was never the same. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking, except to mutter about the voices that called to her constantly. Her research became obsessive. She spent every waking hour studying the house's history, compiling lists of everyone who'd ever died within these walls. 43 souls, she told me one evening, showing her meticulous records. 43 people who died in this house over the past 200 years. And they're all still here, Patrick. All of them. Trapped and angry and hungry. Clara died 3 weeks later. Simply stopped breathing one night as she slept in bed. The doctor called it a heart failure, but I knew better. The spirits had taken what they needed from her and discarded what remained. I should have left the house then. Should have sold it and moved somewhere modern. Somewhere without history or shadows. But Clara's funeral was hardly over when the seances began again. Only this time, Clara was the one speaking from beyond the grave. I woke up one night to find candles lit in the drawing room and the Ouija board set up as Clara used to arrange it. The planchette was moving by itself, spelling out messages in Clara's familiar handwriting. Patrick, come sit with me. I have so much to tell you. I ran from the room, but there was no escape. Over the following nights, the seances continued. Whether I participated or not, the spirits had learned how to manifest without a human medium, drawing energy directly from the house itself. Clara's voice joined the chorus now, but it wasn't the loving wife I remembered. This Clara was cold, calculating, consumed with otherworldly hungers that I didn't yet understand. She spoke of plans of the dead, of barriers between worlds growing thin, of a great gathering that was coming. We were wrong about death, Patrick. Her voice echoed through the house one night. It's not an ending, it's a transformation. We become something more than human, more than alive, and soon, very soon, we'll teach the living what we've learned. The other spirits grew bolder, manifesting as shadows, as whispers in empty rooms, as cold touches in the night. The house itself seemed to pulse with malevolent life, the walls breathing, the floors creaking with the weight of invisible footsteps. I tried to leave, but every time I reached the front door, I found myself back in the drawing room with the candles lit and Clara's voice welcoming me home. The house had become a prison, and I was trapped, just as the spirits are that haunted its halls. The truth came to me slowly. The seances had never been about helping the dead find peace. They'd been a recruitment tool, a way for the spirits to identify potential vessels. Clara had been the first success, and she wouldn't be the last. People still came to the house, seeking contact with their loved ones, drawn by rumours of Clara's gift that persisted even after her death. They didn't know the woman who'd helped them had become something else entirely, something that viewed the living as resources to be harvested. I watched from the windows now as they arrived, grieving parents, heartbroken spouses, children who never got to say goodbye. They think they're coming for comfort, for closure, for one last word with the departed. But they don't realise that they're coming to join them. Clara grants each visitor at the door, looking exactly as she did in life. She leads them to the drawing room with the same compassionate smile, offering tea and understanding and promises of contact with their lost loves. And one by one, they stop leaving. The house is getting crowded now. 43 spirits became 50, then 60, then more than I can count. Each new arrival strengthens the rest, adding to their collective energy. I know my time is soon. I can feel Clara watching me with hungry eyes, hear her whispering my name in tones that promise a terrible reunion. The spirits have learned patience from the decades of waiting, but their hunger is growing beyond their ability to control. Soon they'll have enough energy to break free from the house entirely. Soon they'll walk the streets of Cork in bodies that look alive but aren't, spreading their infection to other families, homes, and communities. And I'll be leading them, wearing Clara's face and speaking with her voice, helping her recruit new souls for their ever-growing congregation. The dead don't rest in peace, I've learned. They plot their return with the patience of eternity, and they never, ever forget the taste of life. If you're reading or listening to this, don't try to find me. Don't come to the house seeking answers or closure or contact with your own departed loved ones. The seances never really end. They just learn to hide themselves better. And Clara is always so very glad to meet you friends.